The Ishaan S Show is a show about the interesting and ever-changing world of American politics. And this show's number one goal is to get more people politically engaged and educated on political matters. I'm very happy to see the support that this show has gotten this season, but in order to achieve this goal that I mentioned, we need more people to start listening to it. If you could do the Ishaan S Show a huge favor and share this episode and all your other favorite episodes with your friends and family, or share our social medias and go follow them yourselves, then this show would be so grateful. Of course, we couldn't have gotten this far without your support. Thank you so much, and the great episode we have planned for you starts right now. Welcome back to the Ishaan S Show. In today's episode, we're going to take a step away from the national scene and take a look at governor elections and recent developments in gubernatorial politics in the last few weeks. We'll talk about the candidates, what they stand for, and how this sets the scene for state politics across the country. We'll be taking a look at those stories and more. Today, December 3rd, 2021. From Anchor by Spotify, this is the Ishaan S Show, a podcast about the interesting and ever-changing world of American politics, all from the perspective of a 15-year-old. With me, your host, Ishaan. Welcome back to the Ishaan S Show. I'm very glad to have you all back, and happy December. Now, it's been a pretty busy week since the last time we got to talk. A multitude of things have happened over this period, and I want to cover everything I can. But looking at it, we only have 20 to 25 minutes on these normal episodes, so getting to every major topic of the week is not going to be easy. But here's a quick rundown of just some of the things that happened this week before we get into today's topic. Now, former President Donald Trump's Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, agreed to testify before the January 6th Commission in the House. This is a major development for the January 6th Committee, and it's the biggest Trump official, one of the closest Trump confidants to actually come to this committee. He's not going to be sitting in front of the panel. He's going to be interviewed for a deposition, so there is a difference. But nonetheless, it is a big step for the January 6th Commission. The U.S. confirmed its first COVID Omicron variant case. It was reported in California. Then a few others were found in Minnesota and Colorado. So Omicron has come to the United States. Congress averted a government shutdown that was supposed to start at midnight tonight by temporarily funding the government through February 18th. The president just signed it into law a few hours ago. There's also been some tensions in the West Wing, specifically from the vice president's office in recent weeks, with the most recent development about VP Harris's top spokesperson, Simone Sanders, leaving the Biden administration less than a year into the job. These are all really big political news stories that would obviously make great Ishaan S Show topics if I could elaborate on them. But of course, they can't all be covered in this single episode. We'll see when these stories come up. Perhaps they may become future episodes, or they might end up on the political news blog of the IshaanSshow.com. We'll see. Now, as I was just discussing, there's been a lot of breaking news in politics over the last 7 days. And 2 of those major stories actually happen to be about the governor's races for next year. Down in Georgia, former Democratic nominee for Georgia Governor Stacey Abrams announced her candidacy for the governorship there again, and up north in Massachusetts, Governor Charlie Baker announced that he wouldn't run for re-election. In addition to that, there are so many other interesting stories in the 2022 governor election cycle that I feel just needed to be covered really soon. So today I want to take a look at the situation for governor's races and their candidates in the following states of Georgia, Michigan, Massachusetts, and Texas. So some of these states don't necessarily seem like swing states looking at Massachusetts and Texas, but they do hold some pretty big significance on the national stage in terms of their gubernatorial election. Let's take a look at some of the most important governor's elections in the 2022 cycle. So it's become evident that Georgia is no longer a reliably Republican state. It's not where it once was. Georgia is a state whose politics has shifted so drastically that this once hardcore Republican state elected Joe Biden to be president of the United States and elected two Democrats, Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, to the U.S. Senate. Georgia's Democratic shift has been pretty evident, actually, since the 2016 election, when Hillary Clinton, I believe, came within 3 points of winning the state. When that happened, I think a lot of people really started wondering about the prospects for the state. Democrats, I'll say, did a decent job capitalizing in 2018 when Donald Trump was president. In 2018, Democrats did not actually win really big overall when you're looking at the national scene, but they set a stage in certain states that really propelled them to success in 2020, and Georgia is a prime example of one of these states. Now, in 2018, for the gubernatorial election, Georgia Secretary of State Brian Kemp ran against then Georgia State House Minority Leader Stacey Abrams. This was one of the most closely watched gubernatorial races, and actually, for that matter, one of the most watched elections in the 2018 midterms. And this was the closest gubernatorial election in Georgia in nearly 50 years. This election, I think, was the first realization for Democrats that, yes, they might actually have a shot at winning Georgia and some other Republican states. After campaigning, Kemp did beat Abrams by 55,000 votes, or less than 1.4%. That's really close. I think after this point, Democrats in the state were a lot more motivated to go and vote. That was a pretty big deficiency for them throughout the 21st century. This election got people to turn out on both sides. I think the number one reason that we saw so much action in this state was because of Donald Trump. He was essentially, as president, a very divisive figure. On one hand, Republicans admired him, and that's what really got so many of them running to the polls to vote for Donald Trump's candidates. And in this case, we're talking about Brian Kemp. And Democrats, on the other hand, did not really like Donald Trump so much. And so they turned out to vote against his candidate and for Stacey Abrams. This race was fueled by increased turnout, and that was pretty much the theme of the 2018 midterms, but especially in Georgia, where I believe there was a lot more participation, and specifically for Stacey Abrams, she was able to tap into a lot of the Atlanta area voter group, which not a lot of people do vote, but 67% of Georgia's population resides in that Atlanta metro area. So a lot of people from there started voting. Didn't start voting, but did turn out to vote. Now, for Democrats specifically here, it really helps set the stage for 2020. This election, I really feel, motivated Georgia Democrats to get more voters out and get them to vote, while Republicans felt more comfortable with their position in this state while this was happening. So ultimately, in 2020, granted it was close, but Joe Biden still prevailed here. And then on January 5th, they called the Senate races for both the Democrats, which literally decided the balance of the U.S. Senate. This year, Stacey Abrams was very much rumored to be planning a rematch against Brian Kemp, and this time in the hopes of working off the work that she did and other Democrats did in the state to win. Brian Kemp is quite unpopular in the Republican Party, and right now, to keep things short, it's because of what he did in January, when he did not support Donald Trump in the 2020 election, when the time came to certify. Rather than endorse Trump's generally unfounded claims of the election being rigged against him in Georgia, Kemp certified his state's electoral college count for Joe Biden, which really pissed off Donald Trump. Trump, I even think, joked that he would rather endorse Stacey Abrams than Kemp. Of course, that's not going to happen, but you can see the mood of this race on the Republican side. And because of the fact that not too many prominent Republicans have actually challenged Kemp here, I don't see many people running in November in his place. So this election, I see it becoming a rematch between Kemp and Abrams, but this time in a very different environment and a very different Georgia. While Georgia is slowly slipping out of the tight grip of the Republican Party's hands, Michigan has also for years, I guess more gradually, been slipping out of the hands of the Democratic Party. For some quick context, in the 2016 election, which is going to be a major reference point just so you guys know, Donald Trump won this state to the surprise of many. Michigan had historically, yes, been close and a swing state, but it was one of those more Democratic swing states, especially in the Rust Belt region. It did lean more Democrat. It elected more Democrats on the state and federal level, which kind of gave reason for many to believe that it couldn't possibly go red. That was kind of the attitude of the Clinton campaign as well. I believe Hillary Clinton didn't actually campaign in Michigan that much, not until the end. And that proved to be really detrimental. But the idea was that Michigan was such a reliable Democrat swing state that perhaps she didn't need to put in that much effort into winning it. In the last couple of weeks of the 2016 cycle, Trump, I guess, really drove up the numbers here. And because of that, he ended up winning this state by 0.22%. And it was actually one of those states that delivered Trump the presidency. It wasn't the state, but it was one of those states within the Rust Belt orbit that really destroyed Hillary Clinton's chances at winning. It still sent shockwaves in the political world despite that 0.22% margin, and especially in Democratic circles. But then 2 years later, then State Senator Gretchen Whitmer ran against then Attorney General Bill Chouette. Whitmer ended up winning the gubernatorial election here by, I believe, 10 points. It was a Democratic wave year, sure, but even then, that was a pretty big margin to win by, so I guess it must have been a reassuring sign for Democrats. Whitmer is a moderate. I mean, she is very policy-based. Her campaign slogan, I believe, was, "Let's fix the damn roads." And I think that that idea resonated with a good number of Michigan voters. She also stayed relatively popular with her supporters in 2019, getting things done, paying lip service to the Trump administration, and especially in that political climate, it wasn't very easy to get that stuff. Then the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and Whitmer joined the class of 2020 governors who had to combat the pandemic in their home state. Whitmer was a little more aggressive with her policies, and this prompted a lot of unpopularity for her amongst the Michigan Republican base, and also actually prompted protests against her tenure by some of these groups. I don't know if some of you remember last year, but there were huge protests in the capital of Lansing against Whitmer's I can't remember if they were stay-at-home orders, but there were huge protests in Michigan against some of these policies. Whitmer, through this time, though, also became a mini celebrity in her own right within the Democratic Party. She was very well known and became one of the most recognizable Democratic politicians after COVID. So much so that she had made it to the final round of vetting to be Joe Biden's running mate. She was, of course, edged out by Kamala Harris, but making it that far in the vice presidential selection process, we could have been easily talking about Vice President Gretchen Whitmer today. Now, what about right now? Well, right now, Whitmer isn't enjoying the same popularity that she enjoyed just a year ago. Now she's facing more criticism from her opponents and pushback from the Republican Party in Michigan, which is really pitting her ability to deliver on her agenda for Michigan. This is definitely harming her favorability, and that's reflected in the polls. In the most recent polling data from September from the Trafalgar Group, Whitmer trails a potential Republican opponent by 6 points. Most other assessments have her either losing by a close margin or winning by a closer margin. Gretchen Whitmer is one of the more recognizable Democratic officials, and with very recognizable name recognition. But with her re-election bid next year, we're looking to see if she can hold on to Michigan's Democrat momentum. All right, so that was a look at the governor elections in Georgia and Michigan. After the break, we'll talk about the governor's races in Texas and Massachusetts, as well as other notable races to keep your eye on. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. All right, so Georgia and Michigan, as we understand, are relatively swingy and more unpredictable in their political nature. And that kind of makes sense. They have developed a much closer to equal Democrat and Republican identities, and that has pushed them to the swing state status over the years. But what about Texas? If you don't know anything about politics, you still know that Texas is super Republican. Texas has built its reputation as being one of the most red states in the country. People even call it the Republican California because of its large population of Republican voters. So you'd think that Texas wouldn't be in a topic like this, but insert 2018 midterms. The basis of a lot of the 2022 midterms is going to be the 2018 midterms. And I think after Georgia, Texas is single-handedly the best example of the impacts of 2018. So as some of you may know, Texas has had an unusually close Senate election 4 years ago between then Representative Beto O'Rourke and Senator Ted Cruz. Now, being in Texas, I don't think a lot of people felt very good about O'Rourke's chances at winning this race. Rightly so, it's Texas. Super Republican, super red. That was the mindset back then. Now, because of the political climate of this country in 2018 that I mentioned earlier, Democrats and Republicans had a lot of momentum building behind their midterm strategies, and this applied to Beto and Ted. Now, this race saw record spending, and subsequently on Election Day, the numbers were driven up like crazy. Now, Ted Cruz is a pretty well-known guy. If you've even dipped your toes into politics and studied Republican politics, I'm sure you'll recognize Cruz. I've probably talked about him before on the show, so with this sort of popularity, I doubt the expectation was for this race to be anything different from the political status quo in Texas. But on Election Day, this unexpectedly got close, and it was shocking a good number of people. Ted Cruz came within 2.6% of losing his Senate seat in what we've usually called a reliably Republican state. Now, going back to the main candidate who was on the other side was within 2.6% of winning this. Beto O'Rourke, he drove a lot of Democratic turnout, which was unheard of in this state. You're probably recognizing O'Rourke's name from his Senate campaign or his failed presidential campaign in 2020, which he had to suspend before getting actual votes. Now, fast forward a couple of years, now O'Rourke is running for governor of Texas. He's challenging incumbent Greg Abbott, who is seeking, I believe, his third term in office. Now, Abbott is probably in the top 3 most well-known GOP governors in the country, and he's another politician who we've covered on this show. He's a Trump ally, does not work with Biden. He's well-known amongst GOP circles. And Beto is a Democrat in a red Texas. I ask you, who would you expect this race to go to? Now, if you answered Abbott, then I see what you're saying. I personally do think that O'Rourke is not in the favorites to win this election. Governor O'Rourke, at least one who beat Governor Greg Abbott, is not as likely to happen. The significance, though, of Beto O'Rourke running in this election is somewhat evident. Like Stacey Abrams, he set a pretty good stage for Democrats in Texas in 2018. And I believe in 2020, Trump actually only won this state by less than 6%. Now, that, the closeness of elections, presidential elections in Texas has been decreasing, or rather, the closeness has been increasing, but Republican margins have been decreasing over a long period of time. But in 2020, that actually dropped. So that, again, is probably due in part to O'Rourke and the Texan Democrats. Their efforts of establishing the Democratic Party here are, for the most part, doing well. So even if Beto O'Rourke is not winning in this election, I think he's acting more as an investment for Democrats in the state. There are plenty of other good Democrats in the state who I think would probably, do a good job carrying the Democratic banner, like Julian Castro or Veronica Escobar. But they've declined to run or haven't shown really any interest in running. So Beto O'Rourke is the Democrats' best bet against Abbott. I'll repeat, I don't think Beto's going to win. He's more of an investment into Texas's Democratic Party to help build that base to make Texas competitive. Now, I think Abbott even recognizes that himself. And so this election is going to be very important in deciding the Republicans' grasp over their party the same way it is in Michigan for the Democrats. Now, if Texas is as red a state can get, Massachusetts is also as a state that's as blue as a state can possibly get. Massachusetts has a long Democratic history and is well known as being the center of liberal politics in New England and one of the most liberal states in the country. So it does surprise a lot of people when they find out that Massachusetts actually has a Republican governor. And on top of that, a 2-term popular Republican governor. When people find this out, they're kind of like, how does this state possibly have a Republican governor? And it's a good question. So the Republican governor of Massachusetts is Charlie Baker. Now, Charlie Baker is one of those liberal Republican governors who, even as a Republican, paid lip service to the Trump administration and is far more open to Democrat-esque policies than maybe somebody like, Greg Abbott. Charlie Baker has been criticized vehemently by Donald Trump and his allies, and there isn't a lot of love from the other end of this relationship. Baker, has been accused of not being conservative enough, among other things, of course, but he's been accused of not being conservative enough. So, like Donald Trump, after coming onto the scene, supposedly set new standards of how conservative a Republican in his Republican Party should be. And Charlie Baker, by a lot of standards, did not meet those levels of conservativeship that Donald Trump set for the Republican Party. Now, there are many notable names who don't fit this category, and many of them are actually notable governors. Charlie Baker is simply a non-Trump Republican, and in this day and age, that's viewed very favorably in this state, but is viewed very unfavorably in the Republican Party. So it wasn't very surprising when Donald Trump endorsed a primary challenger against Baker. Now, what was surprising was recently, I believe, Wednesday, Charlie Baker and his lieutenant governor announced that they would not be seeking re-election in November. It seemed really clear that Charlie Baker was seemingly driven out of this race. I really think he had a good shot at winning the primary, but actually also winning the general election. If you look at his past elections, you'll see that back in 2014, in a red wave year, basically a great year for Republicans, Baker won the governorship here with 48.8% of the vote. Then in 2018, he expanded on that margin with much higher voter turnout in a blue wave year with 66.6%, or practically 2/3 of the votes. Let me repeat that. This was a Republican governor in a deep blue state in a blue wave year, in a year where people like Stacey Abrams were driving the numbers up in Republican Georgia. Here, Baker won by a landslide. Now, you're not going to see me talking about how Massachusetts went red in the presidential election in 2024 because that's not happening. However, Charlie Baker shows that Republicans have the capability of winning in liberal New England if they put up the right candidate. I think that Charlie Baker was probably the best candidate the GOP had who could win this governorship. I'm not saying that the Trump-endorsed candidate can't win, but what I am saying is that the Trump-backed candidate isn't as likely to win as Charlie Baker has already shown he is capable of winning. For the Republican Party, I think being able to say that we kept blue state Massachusetts' governorship red is really beneficial in shaping a narrative about the capabilities of the party in winning swing voters and winning Democrat voters. And really the same thing applies to Democrats in the states where they're not really that favorable but winning, like Joe Manchin in West Virginia. That's a name that really comes to mind with these types of candidates. I don't know if Charlie Baker was pushed out of this election, but his decision to step aside definitely indicates that this formerly Republican governorship may now be in jeopardy. So these were 4 governor's races that I wanted to cover today, and they are all important governor's races that I wanted to cover. Are they all of the governor's races that I wanted to cover? Absolutely not. There are a surprising amount of gubernatorial elections that are going to be very monumental in shaping the direction that this country goes in, that are going to happen next year. In this episode, I wanted to cover some of the main groups of candidates for governor in 2022. In Georgia, I talked about Brian Kemp trying to run without having the backing of the biggest leader in his party, while his former challenger, Stacey Abrams, hopes to reshape politics in the state. I talked about how Gretchen Whitmer faces the challenges of many Midwestern Democrat governors and is now tasked with holding the Democratic Party's mantle next year. In Texas, we talked about Beto O'Rourke running for the 3rd time in 3 years, this time for the governorship, and how he aims to set Texas for Democrats going forward as an investment, while Greg Abbott is going to have to defend the Republican Party's banner in Texas like Whitmer is in Michigan. And in Massachusetts, how a blue state Republican governor, not in Donald Trump's good books, choosing not to run for re-election shows how the balance of power can change in a region quickly. Now, if you want to do some more research on the governor elections next year on your own, I'd suggest you take a look at the governor elections in the states of Kansas, Arizona, Maryland, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. I may even cover these elections in future episodes, we'll see, but those were some of the governor's races that I wanted to cover today, with the recent news from these states about their governor elections. How are they going to do in November? Some can be predicted, while others are just simply toss-ups that are going to be left in the hands of the voters. And so that does it for us here today at the Ishaan S Show. If you liked my commentary, then go ahead and follow at Ishaan S Show on Twitter and at the Ishaan S Show on Instagram for breaking news posts and updates about the show. If you want to learn more about political news stories, then check out my political news blog on the IshaanSshow.com. Do us a favor and share this episode and all the others with your friends and family. It's the best way for this show to grow and get more people listening to it. Thanks again for all your support, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye.